Before we really can begin a discussion of culture, we need to deal with the question of race. If we don't address this issue directly on the front end, then throughout the discussion, as I begin to point to characteristics of culture that seem to influence political beliefs and political results, I'll simply be told, well, but you've got to deal with race. I mean, maybe it was really race. So this issue of race needs to be addressed. And the problem comes because race has had a troubled characteristic in American history. For some, the issue of race has been linked to the notion of humanity, in which people of different races are somehow said to be not fully human. Many who believed in slavery and believed in the right of slavery held that those who were slaves, particularly those who were permanently slaves in the South prior to the Civil War, were inferior in intelligence and not quite fully human. These people could believe in the words of the Declaration that all men are created equal, but then some of the men that were being kept as slaves were not fully human. There were people, obviously, who opposed slavery and who opposed this inequality in the definition of human beings by saying, well, all of these races existed, but they were all equal. And yet, even those who opposed slavery sometimes felt that some of different skin color, different races, were somehow inferior. In the 20th century, these notions shifted again, and the word race came to be used as the equivalent of ethnicity. One of the most progressive presidents in American history, Theodore Roosevelt, a man who broke the color bar by inviting Booker T. Washington to attend the White House, which was unprecedented before that time, despite his progressiveness on this, and despite that he paid a high price politically for having done so. He never invited Washington or another African American to the White House again, and no one did it again for a good 30 years. But Roosevelt was commonly used the word race to talk about the Filipinos. But ethnically, they were the same race, no matter how you construed it, as himself. So he couldn't be fully accurate in the use of the word race. By the 20th century, it was commonplace to refer to race as subgroups within human beings who were Caucasian, Negroid, and Mongoloid. Caucasians were whites, Negroes were blacks, the Mongoloids were yellow. Well, this sort of breakdown itself broke down because there were plenty of people who had very dark skin pigmentation, like the people in the subcontinent of India, often darker, often with greater pigmentation than those Negroes from Africa, and that didn't work. And then, indeed, it was possible to find Mongoloid people, such as those in Mongolia or in Tibet, who had darker skin tone than many who were Negroes. The whole system didn't work very well. And it was problematic because, again, people sought to tie the notion of skin color to levels of intelligence. This was further complicated when it came to the question of intermarriage between people of what were supposed to be different races. And in order to define them after intermarriage had occurred, instead of just simply referring to them as mixed, what happened is the definition was used in America that if you had one drop of blood from an inferior race, and that was always the Negroes, or the Negroid race, one drop of that blood made you a member of the Negro race. This sort of thinking led to the perpetuation of things like segregation, where people could be segregated on skin color, even if it was very light skin color, on the notion that they had just one drop of African American blood. All of this brings us to the discussion of the journey of man and Spencer Wells. Spencer Wells offers very substantial evidence that there is only one race, that race existed 100,000 years ago in Southwest Africa, and that from there they moved across the globe. As they moved across the globe and were in different climatic conditions, changes occurred, mutations occurred, and some of them lost their heaviest pigmentation and developed white skin. Others developed a perhaps yellow tint skin because of their results. And certain other mutations occurred that were carried forward over time. It can seem surprising to anyone that so many changes, so many different skin textures and eye shapes and eye colors could change, but 100,000 years is a sufficient amount of time for considerable mutation. If you wanted to talk about it, if you wanted to use a comparative example, you could use what happened in the species of canines. What happened? Well, we know that all canines, all dogs of any size, shape, name, breed, whatever, came from a certain species of wolf, probably a species that is now extinct. About 10,000 years ago, they began to be domesticated. That is, they were deliberately bred or interbred for certain characteristics. And today, 10,000 years after dogs were first bred, well, we have a range in size in the dog kingdom among the species of canines that runs from Chihuahuas at the small end to Great Danes or Alsatians or St. Bernards at the big end. How you could imagine any greater range, I can't imagine. But breeding of domesticated animals, whether they're dogs or cats or horses or cows, are remarkable. The shapes and colors and sizes and textures of fur are all over the place. So it is not possible that random, it seems to be perfectly possible to imagine that over 100,000 years, the changes that we observe could have happened. This much is key. The genetic evidence from Africa shows that Homo sapiens on this planet, the Homo sapiens that existed today, all were descended from people whose DNA can be discovered still existing in certain people in southwestern Africa. All of them are part of one race. If you had to try to use the word Negro or Caucasian or Mongoloid to describe them, you'd have to say that they're all a part of the Negroid race. But it's not necessary to use these words, which may have taken on certain cultural and even pejorative meanings. It is simply enough to say that we are all human beings. We are all Homo sapiens, and we all had a common core. Are there individual variations? Yes, of course. Every individual human being is an individual. They all have unique DNA. The issue of race is, can you group the DNA of all these 7 billion individual humans into categories, as few as 3, and you can't. Even before this kind of DNA evidence was available, people noticed skin color and eye tone, and they tried to categorize it. And when 3 categories didn't work, they expanded it to 5 or 6, and then to 12. And as a matter of fact, if you use skin color as a characteristic, you go to South America, you discover there are as many as 100 different races. But of course, this is impractical. There's no sensible outcome from having a race that is so individualized. So, questions of race, I think, should not be a part of our discussion. It is worth noting that most of the racial discussion I've been making is race based on a very small number of characteristics. If DNA strands made large enough were stretched end to end, they could travel to the moon and back perhaps 3,000 times. Yet the amount of the source of pigmentation, 1 spot, 2 spots, a half dozen spots in a string of DNA that's that long. Obviously, to use skin color or eye color or texture of hair to separate out races is unrealistic. It's as unrealistic as trying to use height or weight as a source of separation of races. And nobody that I know of tries to do that. It's worth noting, too, that race itself is a social construct. And it may, in fact, be a proof of what we're going to consider later in the course, the sources of cultural understandings of differences between people. If these views seem to be unusual or outlandish or not correct to you, let me try to back up what I said now by quoting from some important organizations. These are definitions that are provided by professional academic organizations. The American Anthropological Association, drawing on biological research, currently holds, quote, "The concept of race is a social and cultural construction. Race simply cannot be tested or proven scientifically." And further, it is clear that human populations are not unambiguous, clearly demarked, biologically distinct groups. The concept of race has no validity in the human species. The American Association of Physical Anthropologists holds this: "Pure races do not exist in the human species today, nor is there any evidence that they ever existed in the past." And the official viewpoint of the American Anthropological Association is, quote, "Evidence from the analysis of genetics," that is DNA, "indicates that most physical variation lies within so-called racial groups. This means there is a greater variation within racial groups than between them." In other words, it's just as likely that two African Americans could be further apart from one another than either of those African Americans is to another white person. The concept of race, white, black, yellow, Caucasian, Negroid, or Mongoloid, simply has no basis. That does not mean that there are not cultural differences. And when I say this, I am not at all attacking anyone's cultural background. I'm indeed saying that cultural background is what is most important and what we need to discuss most carefully, as I will hope to do in future classes.